Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. It started like any other hunting trip, but by the end of the day, I wished I'd stayed home. I parked my truck on the side of an old logging road, a good 10 miles from the nearest paved highway, the kind of place where even the wind seems to think twice before passing through. The forest here always felt older, like it had seen things no one was meant to see. But I shook it off. I wasn't the superstitious type. This area was a hunter's dream. The October air bit at my exposed skin as I shouldered my pack and checked my rifle one final time. My breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the cold morning air. The temperature had dropped below freezing the night before, leaving a thin layer of frost on everything. Each step crunched softly on the frozen leaves as I made my way toward the trail entrance. Something felt different about this particular morning. The usual sounds were absent. No chattering squirrels, no distant bird calls, not even the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. I attributed it to the cold snap. Animals often went quiet when the temperature dropped suddenly. Still, the absence of life created an unsettling vacuum that seemed to swallow even my own footsteps. I'd hunted these woods for over 15 years, since I was barely old enough to hold a rifle steady. My father had brought me here first, teaching me to track, to read signs, to respect the wilderness. The old man always said these woods demanded respect, but never explained why. Now, standing at the mouth of the trail with my truck disappearing behind the tree line, I wondered if I should have pressed him for details. The first mile into the woods went smoothly enough. The trail was overgrown in places, thick with brambles and roots that seemed to claw at my boots. Above me, the canopy blocked out most of the afternoon sun, leaving the woods bathed in a dim greenish light. I'd chosen this spot because I'd seen fresh buck tracks the week before. Big ones. But today, the woods felt different. The silence grew thicker with each step. Not just quiet, silent in a way that made my ears ring. I stopped frequently to listen, expecting to hear something, anything that would indicate normal forest life. Instead, I heard only my own breathing, magnified in the stillness until it sounded labored and intrusive. Dead trees stood at odd angles, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Some had fallen across the path, forcing me to climb over or around them. The bark on many trees showed deep gouges, far too large and numerous to be normal animal marks. They ran in parallel lines, as if something with massive claws had methodically marked its territory. Fresh sap still oozed from some of the wounds. I paused to examine one particularly disturbing set of marks. The gouges were at least 8 feet off the ground, carved deep into the solid oak. Whatever had made them possessed incredible strength. The wood fibers were shredded, not cut clean like axe marks would be. These looked more like something had violently raked its claws down the trunk in a frenzy of aggression. My hands began to sweat despite the cold. Every hunter knows to read the signs, and these signs were screaming warnings I didn't want to acknowledge. But I'd come too far to turn back now, and my practical mind kept offering rational explanations. Bears, probably. A large black bear marking territory. Nothing more sinister than that. After about an hour, I reached the clearing I'd scouted earlier. It was a perfect setup, a small meadow surrounded by dense underbrush. If anything crossed through, I'd have a clear shot from my blind. I climbed up into the tree stand I'd rigged last season, settling in for the evening. The sun was just beginning to dip below the tree line, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. From my elevated position, I could see the entire clearing and several game trails that converged at its center. This should have been prime hunting territory, but something felt fundamentally wrong. The grass in the meadow was trampled in strange patterns, Not the random paths of grazing deer, but deliberate circles and lines that formed no recognizable pattern. As I adjusted my position in the stand, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Scattered throughout the clearing were bones. Not the typical remains left by predators, but bones that had been arranged. Cleaned completely of flesh and positioned in small piles, each stack containing different types. All leg bones in one pile, all ribs in another, skulls grouped separately. The skulls were the worst part. They weren't all from the same type of animal. I could identify deer skulls, raccoons, a few that might have been rabbits, and others I couldn't place. But they all shared one disturbing characteristic. Each skull showed signs of blunt force trauma, as if something had systematically crushed the cranium of every animal in the clearing. I forced myself to breathe steadily and focus on the tree line. Whatever had done this might still be in the area, and if it was, I wanted to see it coming. The sun continued its descent, casting longer shadows across the meadow. The bone piles caught the fading light, creating a macabre landscape that belonged in nightmares, not nature. For a while, I let the peace of the woods wash over me. Hunting isn't just about pulling the trigger. It's about sitting still, blending in, and letting the forest forget you're there. But the peace didn't last long. The first scream cut through the quiet like a blade. High-pitched and ragged, it sent a jolt through my chest. A rabbit, I thought. Probably a hawk or a fox got hold of it. But the sound didn't stop. It just kept going. A horrible, gut-wrenching wail that made my skin crawl. If you've ever heard a rabbit scream, you know it's not a sound you forget. But this was worse, longer, louder, and more desperate than any animal cry I'd ever heard. The scream rose and fell in waves, each one more piercing than the last. It echoed off the trees, creating a chorus of agony that seemed to come from every direction at once. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound penetrated through my palms, reverberating inside my skull until I thought I might go mad. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, like the whole forest was holding its breath. My hands shook as I gripped my rifle tighter, scanning the underbrush through my scope. That's when I noticed the blood. Dark stains had appeared on the grass below my stand, forming a rough circle around the bone piles. The blood was fresh, still gleaming wetly in the fading light. It hadn't been there moments before. I was certain of that. Somehow, during that horrific screaming, something had bled extensively in the clearing below me. The metallic smell of blood mixed with something else, something rotten and sweet that made my stomach turn. I fought the urge to vomit, focusing instead on staying absolutely still. Whatever had caused that scream might still be nearby, and I had no intention of announcing my presence. I adjusted my scope and scanned the clearing, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a deer, a pale shape moving low to the ground, weaving through the thicket about 30 yards away. But something about the way it moved was fundamentally wrong. Its limbs jerked awkwardly, like a marionette controlled by a drunk puppeteer. The creature moved in stops and starts, occasionally pausing to cock its head at unnatural angles. Even through my scope, I could see that its proportions were off. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, the head too small for its body. I squinted through the scope, trying to make out details, but the undergrowth was too thick. The thing's skin appeared almost translucent, showing dark veins beneath like a roadmap of corruption. It had no hair that I could see, just smooth, pallid flesh that seemed to glow with its own sickly light. It vanished behind a tree, and I held my breath, waiting for it to reappear. Minutes passed, but it didn't emerge. Instead, I heard a new sound, a wet, sliding noise, like something dragging itself across wet leaves. The sound moved in a circle around the clearing, always staying just beyond my line of sight. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing like grasping fingers. I should have felt relieved when the pale shape disappeared, but instead, a cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. The sliding sound continued, methodically working its way around the perimeter of the meadow. Then I realized what was happening. The thing was circling me, staying in the dense brush where I couldn't get a clear shot. It knew I was here. It knew exactly where I was positioned, and it was hunting me just as deliberately as I had come here to hunt. The sun had nearly set when I heard the voice for the first time. Soft at first, barely more than a whisper carried on the still air. "Help," it said. Just that one word, repeated over and over in a flat, emotionless tone. "Help, help, help." The words floated through the trees, but there was no inflection, no urgency that you'd expect from someone in distress. It sounded mechanical, like a recording played through a damaged speaker. Not a plea, not a cry for assistance, just a statement repeated with robotic precision. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to stay perfectly still. The voice came from where the pale figure had disappeared, continuing its monotonous chant. "Help! Help! Help!" Each repetition was identical to the last, devoid of any human emotion or variation. 15 times it repeated the word. I counted each one, my finger hovering over the trigger of my rifle. Then it stopped, leaving the woods so silent I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. The absence of the voice was somehow more terrifying than the sound itself. A sharp crack broke the stillness, loud as a gunshot, the sound of a large branch snapping under considerable weight. The crack was followed by an explosion of motion as birds burst from the trees, squirrels skittered up trunks, and a small herd of deer crashed through the brush on the far side of the clearing, running as if something was chasing them. But there were no footsteps, no sound of pursuit. Just that single crack, followed by pandemonium, then absolute silence. Whatever had broken that branch was still out there, but it moved without making any noise at all. The very trees seemed to shrink away from its presence. I remained frozen in my stand, afraid that even the slightest movement would draw its attention. Sweat ran down my back despite the cold, and my muscles began to cramp from holding the same position for so long. The darkness was complete now, with only scattered moonlight filtering through the canopy. I sat there, paralyzed by fear and indecision. My rifle was clutched so tightly my knuckles had gone white, but I couldn't shake the feeling that bullets wouldn't stop whatever was out there. The clearing was empty now, but the sensation of being watched pressed against me like a physical weight. I knew I had to get out of there, but leaving the relative safety of the tree stand felt like stepping into a trap. The forest was dark, and my only light source was back in the truck. All I had was the faint moonlight filtering through the branches, casting twisted shadows across the ground. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to move. Staying in the stand would only delay the inevitable. I couldn't spend the night up there, and whatever was hunting me seemed patient enough to wait. The first step down from the stand felt like crossing a threshold into hell. My boots hit the soft earth with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the stillness. The clearing stretched out before me, the bone piles now invisible in the darkness but still present in my mind like a map of death. I stayed low, rifle at the ready, and made my way toward the trail. I hadn't gone more than 20 yards when I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, just behind me, crunching softly on the dry leaves. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath. The sound stopped too. Whatever was following me was smart enough to match my movements, to use my own noise to mask its approach. I forced myself forward, keeping my pace steady, despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The trail felt narrower than it had on the way in, like the forest had grown overnight. Branches reached out from the darkness, snagging at my sleeves and pack, slowing me down with deliberate malice. The footsteps resumed, closer now and more distinct. They had a strange quality to them. Not quite human, but not animal either. Too heavy for the pale, thin creature I'd glimpsed, but too irregular for a normal person. Sometimes there would be 3 or 4 steps in rapid succession, then a long pause, then a single heavy impact that shook the ground. "Who's there?" My voice cut through the darkness, steadier than I expected. The footsteps stopped immediately, but I could feel something listening, evaluating, deciding. The silence stretched on until I thought I might scream just to break it. Then, faint and far too calm, I heard it again. "Over here. Please. Over here." The voice was closer now, maybe 50 feet behind me, and it carried that same flat, emotionless quality, like someone practicing human speech without understanding what the words meant. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and started moving faster, almost jogging, despite the darkness and uneven terrain. The footsteps matched my pace immediately, no longer trying to hide. They crashed through the underbrush now, following my path with disturbing accuracy. The trail twisted and turned, each bend feeling like it led deeper into a carefully laid trap. My lungs burned from the cold air and exertion, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, the pursuit continued with mechanical persistence, never gaining ground, but never falling behind either. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. Just for a second, barely more than a flash in the moonlight, I saw something moving between the trees. It was pale and hunched, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Its movements were jerky and wrong, like a spider trying to walk upright. And its eyes, God help me, its eyes. They reflected the moonlight like an animal's, but they were too large, too knowing. They locked onto mine for just an instant, and in that moment I saw an intelligence that was both alien and malevolent. It wasn't just following me, it was enjoying the hunt. I stumbled and went down hard, landing on my side with the rifle clattering away into the darkness. For a moment I just lay there, gasping for breath and waiting for those terrible hands to close around my throat. But the footsteps had stopped again. I rolled onto my back, frantically searching for my rifle. The breathing reached me first, low and raspy, like air being drawn through damaged tissue. It was close, maybe 10 feet away, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. I found my rifle and raised it toward the sound, my hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. The breathing stopped. Then, from directly above me, came a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A low, wet clicking, like a tongue exploring the inside of a dry mouth. Something was in the trees directly overhead, looking down at me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I rolled to my feet and ran, crashing through the brush with complete abandon. Branches tore at my clothes and face, but I didn't care. All that mattered was reaching the truck, reaching safety, reaching the world of normal things that didn't click and breathe and hunt in the darkness. When I finally burst out onto the gravel road, it felt like surfacing from deep water. But the feeling of safety was an illusion. The forest behind me rustled with movement, and I could feel those terrible eyes watching from the tree line. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the truck. I threw myself inside, locking the doors and starting the engine in one motion. As I reversed onto the road, I made the mistake of looking in the rearview mirror. It was there, standing just at the edge of the trees. Tall and pale and impossibly thin, with those reflective eyes that caught my headlights like mirrors. It didn't move as I drove away, just watched with that patient, predatory stillness that told me this wasn't over. I floored the accelerator, gravel spraying from my tires as I tore down that lonely road. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, and even then I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see that pale figure following in the darkness. I never went back to those woods, never will. because some things are better left undisturbed, and some hunts end with the hunter becoming the hunted. The forest keeps its secrets, and I intend to let it keep mine. Even when I was little, I had a great love for Michigan. Ever since my parents decided on an impromptu spring vacation up in the vacation home that belonged to my grandparents, I was smitten. The secluded cabin, the field splayed out right beside it that I could play all day in. What wasn't there to love? That cabin was my safe place. There was nothing up there I didn't find absolutely breathtaking and wonderful. That was until a few years ago. In 2019, my husband and I had finally tied the knot after being together for 6 years. And that's when my parents gave us the news that they would be selling us the cabin. In only a matter of 4 days, after deciding to spend our honeymoon up in Michigan before packing up our lives back home, Ryan, my husband, and I were catching a flight to our new home. The familiarity of the gravel road crunching beneath the rental car's tires was what woke me from my unintentional sleep, as well as Ryan's low whistle and amazement at the acres of land. Wow, hun, you weren't kidding. This place is something else. I laughed. When will you learn I'm always right? In the midst of our banter, Ryan had parked the car in the middle of the large driveway, and the second the car doors automatically unlocked, I was outside, breathing in the fresh air. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered from my childhood visits, though now it seemed smaller somehow. The dark wood siding had weathered to a deep gray, and the wraparound porch creaked ominously under my feet as I approached. Something felt different this time, though I couldn't place what it was. The silence was too complete, too heavy. Even the birds seemed to avoid this place. We pulled our luggage from the trunk, and I practically sprinted up the front stairs with my suitcase thumping up them behind me. "Hurry up, slowpoke. Our honeymoon awaits." Ryan only shook his head and laughed. "Carmen, I love you, but we both know you couldn't give a crap about our honeymoon right now. You just want to get inside and bask in the memories of your youth." I rolled my eyes, taking the keys from my husband's hand once he reached me. "Are you calling me old?" I turned the key in the lock, twisting the door handle. The door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Dust particles floated in the air inside the cabin, cloth tarps covering the furniture. No one had been up here since my grandparents passed away in 2013. Even when my parents found out they inherited the place, they never visited. The interior smelled of mildew and something else I couldn't identify. Something sour and unpleasant that made my stomach turn. The floorboards creaked with every step, and I noticed several of them were loose, creating gaps where shadows seemed to pool. The windows were grimy, filtering the afternoon light into an eerie amber glow that made everything look diseased. "Needs more than a good dusting," I muttered, but forced a smile for Ryan's benefit. "I think we can handle that." Ryan held on to me tightly, looking around the house with growing concern. "It's rustic," he said diplomatically, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. That first night, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. They were slow, deliberate, circling the cabin like someone was looking for a way in. Ryan was fast asleep beside me, exhausted from our travel and the day of cleaning. I lay frozen, listening to the measured pace of boots on wooden planks. The steps would pause at each window, and I imagined someone peering through the glass, studying us as we slept. The month of our honeymoon was perfect for the most part. Some light cleaning and relaxing. It was halfway through our stay there that Ryan and I found out we were expecting. It hadn't been planned, but we were absolutely ecstatic nonetheless. In fact, my pregnancy was one of the reasons my husband left the night of my first real encounter with this person. My cravings had come in full force, and Ryan, being the great husband he is, drove the hour-long journey into town to get me my potato chips and mint chocolate chip ice cream. The nearest store was in Brookfield, a small town that seemed to exist solely to serve the scattered cabins and hunting lodges in the area. The locals there were friendly enough, but they all seemed to know something about our property that they weren't sharing. Alone in the cabin, I was lying under my blanket on the couch, dozing off to the sounds of the TV when the knocking began. At first, I thought it was just the old house settling, but then it came again. 3 deliberate knocks on the front door. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't the TV. Someone was actually pounding on the front door. I've always been scared of being by myself when it was dark. All I know is that when night fell, my skin would crawl and I would jump at the smallest of sudden noises. My body was frozen in its spot. My heart began to thump rapidly against my chest. The knocking continued, growing more insistent, more demanding. Then came the voice. "Carmen? Carmen, let me in, it's Ryan." But it wasn't Ryan's voice, not really. It sounded like someone trying to imitate him, getting the tone wrong, the inflection all off. The voice was too rough, too strained, like someone who had been screaming for hours. I couldn't move. I couldn't even twitch. The only thing I could do was lay frozen as tears began to stream down my face. The voice continued calling my name, but with each repetition it became less and less like my husband's voice. It grew deeper, more guttural, with an edge that made my skin crawl. "I know you're in there, Carmen. I can see you through the window." The voice was taunting now, cruel. "Why won't you let me in? Don't you love me anymore?" When the banging stopped, I thought it was over, but I was entirely wrong. Heavy footsteps began to move around the cabin, and I could hear someone testing the windows, trying to find one that might be unlocked. The person moved methodically, checking each window in turn, and I realized with growing horror that they knew the layout of the cabin perfectly. My eyes widened as I realized my horrible mistake. The curtains right beside the TV were pulled open. I'd forgotten to pull them down. As the footsteps grew closer to the living room, I knew that whoever this was would soon be able to see me through the window, and I would be able to see them. What I did next made me feel like I was 5 years old again, but I pulled my blanket over my head and curled in on myself. I couldn't help it. I was terrified. The footsteps stopped directly outside the living room window, and I heard the scraping of fingernails against glass. Right after I pulled my blanket over my eyes, a sharp tapping sound came from the window. Then I heard breathing, heavy and labored, pressed against the glass. The person was so close I could hear their breath fogging the window. "I can see you hiding," the voice whispered, and now it didn't sound like Ryan at all. It was the voice of a stranger, someone who had been watching us, learning our routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "You can't hide from me forever, Carmen. I know all about you. I know about the baby." How could this person know about the pregnancy? We had only found out ourselves a few days ago. The thought that someone had been watching us so closely made my stomach turn. Had they been spying on us through the windows? Following us to town? The violation felt absolute. The thing outside let out a sound that was half laugh, half growl. It was the sound of someone who had lost their grip on sanity long ago. As I lay there on the brink of sobbing out of fear, I heard keys jingling in the front door. My heart skipped a beat. Ryan was home, but that person was still standing outside the window. I heard rapid footsteps moving away from the window, but I didn't dare look. The front door opened and Ryan's confused voice called out, "Carmen, why are all the lights off? Are you okay?" I pulled the blanket from my face, my eyes adjusting to the light as Ryan switched on the lamps. His concerned expression quickly turned to alarm when he saw my tear-stained face and how violently I was shaking. Hey, what happened?" His voice was gentle, warm, nothing like the cruel imitation I'd heard outside. I tried to speak, but the only thing that came out was a sob. I wrapped my arms around my husband, unable to stop looking at that window. "Close it," I whispered. "What?" Ryan sounded puzzled. "Close it, Ryan. Please close it." I jumped from the couch and yanked the drapes closed with such force I nearly tore them from the rod. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Carmen, honey, what's wrong? I can't help you if you don't tell me what happened." Ryan grabbed me by my shoulders, turning me away from the window. "There was someone out there, Ryan. They were pretending to be you, trying to get me to open the door. They knew about the baby." The tears came back full force. Ryan's face went pale. "Someone was here? On our property?" I nodded, and I could see the anger building in his eyes. Not at me, but at whoever had terrorized his pregnant wife. "Did you see who it was?" I shook my head. I was too scared to look. But Ryan, they knew things about us. Personal things. They've been watching us. The police arrived nearly 2 hours later. Officer Bradley was a local man who seemed to know the area well. He took down our statement and searched the perimeter of the cabin with his flashlight. When he came back, his expression was grim. "Found some disturbed earth under the living room window," he said. "Boot prints, size 11 or 12. Someone was definitely there." What he didn't tell us until later was that he'd also found something else. A small notebook hidden in the woodpile, filled with detailed observations about our daily routines. Times when we left the cabin, what we ate, when we went to bed. The handwriting was erratic, sometimes neat, sometimes barely legible, as if written by someone in the grip of obsession. Despite the police report and the evidence, Ryan and I decided to stay. We made modifications to the cabin: security cameras, motion sensors, and a new lock system. We even got gun licenses and purchased 2 firearms. The local hardware store owner, Pete, seemed unsurprised by our purchases. "You're not the first folks up that way to have trouble," he said cryptically. Years passed, and the incidents became a regular part of our lives. Strange sounds in the night, dead animals left on our property, and the constant feeling of being watched. Our daughter Grace was born the following spring, and 2 years later, our son Danny joined the family. We tried to give them a normal childhood, but it was impossible to ignore the tension that hung over our home. The dead animals were the worst part. We'd find them arranged in deliberate patterns: rabbits in perfect circles, birds with their wings spread wide, as if someone was trying to send us a message. The local veterinarian, Dr. Morrison, said the animals had been killed cleanly, professionally, with surgical precision. "This isn't random," she told us. "Someone knows what they're doing." Grace started having nightmares when she was 3, always about the man at the window. We'd tried to dismiss it as a child's imagination, but she was too specific in her descriptions. "He has yellow teeth," she'd say, "and his eyes are too big for his face." Ryan and I would exchange worried glances, knowing that we'd never told her about our encounters. The incident that finally drove us away happened just last month. I was working late at the garage in town. My friend Kevin had called saying he was short-staffed and needed help. Ryan was home with the kids, and everything seemed normal until my phone rang at 8 o'clock. "Carmen? Carmen, where are you?" Ryan's voice was frantic, and I could hear both children crying in the background. "I'm still at work, you know that. What's wrong? Are the kids okay?" The terror in my husband's voice made my heart race. "You can't be at work," Ryan said, his voice breaking. "Carmen, you're outside. You're standing at the window staring at us. You've been there for 20 minutes. The phone line went quiet except for the sound of Grace sobbing. My daughter's voice came through the phone, high-pitched with terror. "Mommy, why won't you come inside? Why are you just standing there?" I could hear little Danny crying in the background, calling for me. "That's not me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Ryan, that's not me. Call the police and get the kids away from the windows." I was already running to my car, my hands shaking as I tried to get the keys in the ignition. The drive home was the longest hour of my life. When I finally reached our property, I saw Ryan's truck parked at the gate, engine running. The kids were in the back seat, and Ryan was standing beside the vehicle with his rifle. His face was white with terror. "I saw you," he said when I approached. "I saw you standing at the window, but your face was all wrong. Your eyes were too wide, and your mouth was open like you were screaming, but no sound was coming out. And then you started smiling, but it wasn't your smile, it was someone else's smile using your face. We left that night and never went back. The police found no evidence of an intruder, but they did find something else. A crude shelter built in the woods behind our cabin, filled with photographs of our family taken through telephoto lenses. Pictures of us sleeping, eating, playing with the children. Hundreds of them, going back years. We're currently staying with Kevin and his wife while we look for a new place. The cabin that I once considered paradise has become a nightmare that will forever haunt me. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear someone calling my name from outside the window. But now I know better than to look. The police investigation is ongoing, but Officer Bradley told us privately that we're not the first family to abandon property in that area. There's something about that stretch of woods, he said. Brings out the worst in people. Makes them do things they'd never normally do. I don't know if we'll ever find out who was tormenting us or why they chose our family. All I know is that the person who spent years watching us, learning our habits, imitating our voices, is still out there. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if they found a new family to terrorize, or if they're still waiting for us to come home. Amanda, my fiancée, and I were on hour 17 into our drive to her family's cabin in northern Minnesota for what we desperately hoped would be a restorative vacation. The stress of our jobs had been crushing us both. My work at the accounting firm had become unbearable with the constant deadlines, and Amanda's nursing shifts at the hospital were taking their toll. We needed this escape more than anything. I glanced at her with heavy eyelids to see that she was fast asleep in the passenger seat, her auburn hair catching the dim light from the dashboard. The last 2 hours of the trip were spent navigating desolate back roads through towns that consisted of maybe 100 people and a lone stoplight. Each mile took us further from civilization, further from the suffocating routine that had been strangling us both. The roads began to be labeled by numbers instead of names. County Road 47, State Highway 23, Forest Route 156. Each sign seemed to mark our descent into a more primitive world. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as exhaustion crept through my bones. The GPS on my phone had lost signal an hour ago, leaving us to navigate by Amanda's handwritten directions from her childhood memories. Finally, I turned onto the long stretch of gravel road that wound through the dense forest and led to our destination. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating towering pine trees that seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of shadows above us. The car slowly trudged over the underdeveloped road as large chunks of gravel crunched and tumbled beneath the wheels, the sound echoing through the silence like bones breaking. Amanda stirred slightly as we hit a particularly deep pothole but didn't wake. Her breathing was steady and peaceful, a stark contrast to the growing unease that was settling in my stomach. Something about this place felt wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Maybe it was just the isolation, the way the forest seemed to swallow all sound except for our engine and the grinding of gravel beneath our tires. We arrived at the cabin just after 1 a.m., and I was so exhausted that I seriously considered just sleeping right there in the driveway. The cabin appeared suddenly in our headlights, emerging from the darkness like something from a half-remembered dream. I'd never been to this place before, but upon first glance it looked cozy enough. A modest 2-story structure with weathered wood siding and a wraparound porch that faced the lake. It wasn't one of those elaborate vacation homes that wealthy people built, but it had character. 3 bedrooms, Amanda had told me, and it sat just offshore from a small lake that stretched about 1,100 acres, according to the faded sign we'd passed a mile back. The moonlight reflected off the water's surface, creating an almost hypnotic pattern of silver ripples. We quickly unloaded our luggage, our movements sluggish with fatigue. The night air was crisp and carried the scent of pine needles and something else, something damp and organic that I couldn't identify. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust, with underlying notes of decades of use by Amanda's extended family. We collapsed onto a bed that seemed to creak under our weight, the mattress soft with age. Though we were completely exhausted, there was something exciting about being here, away from everything that had been weighing us down. No deadlines, no emergencies, no constant buzzing of phones and notifications. Just the sound of wind through the trees and the gentle lapping of water against the shore somewhere in the darkness beyond the windows. The sun filtered through the thin curtains early the next morning, painting golden rectangles across the hardwood floor. I was filled with an enormous sense of relief when, out of habit, I checked my phone to see that there was no service whatsoever. The screen showed no service where the bars usually appeared, and somehow that felt like the most beautiful thing I'd seen in months. Nobody could reach us even if they tried. Amanda stretched beside me, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "How do you feel about exploring this place?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the long drive and deep sleep. She looked more relaxed than I'd seen her in months, even after just one night away from our usual environment. "I'd love to see what your family has been talking about all these years," I replied, genuinely curious about this place that had been such a significant part of her childhood summers. Amanda offered to drive to the nearest town to get some groceries and supplies so I could settle in and explore the cabin myself. She wanted to call her parents from town to let them know we'd arrived safely, since our phones were useless here. The nearest town with cell service was about 30 minutes away through those winding forest roads. After she left, I spent time rifling through hundreds of dusty books that sat on the shelves in the living room. Most were classic novels and local history books, their pages yellowed with age and their bindings cracked from decades of Minnesota humidity. I pulled out a dozen board games from a built-in cabinet, excitedly planning out our time ahead. Monopoly, Scrabble, chess sets with missing pieces, card games I hadn't played since childhood. The cabin felt different in the daylight. What had seemed cozy and welcoming the night before now felt somehow isolated and vulnerable. The windows faced in every direction, offering views of the surrounding forest and the lake, but also creating the sensation of being watched from multiple angles. I found myself checking the windows frequently, though I couldn't say what I was looking for. I made my way outside and onto the dock that stretched out into the lake. The wooden planks were weathered gray and soft in places where decades of moisture had begun the slow process of decay. A small aluminum fishing boat was tied up at the end, bobbing gently in the morning breeze. The dock creaked and groaned under my weight, the sound carrying across the water and echoing back from the distant shoreline. Standing there, looking out at the lake, I felt the last of my work anxiety begin to dissipate. The water was surprisingly clear, and I could see fish moving in the shallows near the dock. The morning air was clean and cold, carrying the scent of pine and lake water. For the first time in months, I took a deep breath that felt like it actually filled my lungs completely. That's when I noticed the island. A small island sat close to the middle of the lake, maybe 100 yards in diameter, covered with dense trees and undergrowth that looked almost impenetrable. From the dock, it appeared to be roughly circular, with no visible clearings or structures, just a thick tangle of vegetation that seemed darker and more dense than the forest surrounding the lake. Something about it immediately drew my attention in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't particularly remarkable, just a small patch of land surrounded by water, but I found myself staring at it, trying to make out details through the morning mist that clung to its shores. There was something almost magnetic about it, as if it was pulling my gaze whenever I tried to look away. The island seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. While the rest of the lake sparkled in the morning sun, the waters around the island appeared darker, more still. Even the gentle breeze that was creating ripples across the rest of the lake's surface seemed to die out as it approached that particular patch of water. Since Amanda would be gone for at least an hour, I decided to take the fishing boat out and try my luck. The boat was old but sturdy, with a small outboard motor that started on the third pull. I'd brought my fishing gear with high hopes of catching dinner, and the island seemed like it might provide some good fishing spots along its perimeter. As I motored across the lake, the island grew larger and more imposing. What had seemed like a small patch of trees from the dock revealed itself to be a substantial piece of land, with dense forest that blocked any view of its interior. The trees grew right to the water's edge, their branches hanging low over the surface, creating deep shadows that made it impossible to see the shoreline clearly. I anchored about 50 feet from what appeared to be the island's southern shore and started casting. The water here was noticeably colder than it had been near the cabin and seemed to have a different quality, thicker somehow, more viscous. My line disappeared into the dark water, and I settled in to wait for a bite. It wasn't 30 seconds before I felt something hit my boat. Not a gentle bump, but a solid thud that rocked the small aluminum vessel. I looked around, expecting to see a log or a piece of debris, but the water around me was clear. I'd nearly had whatever was on my line up to the boat when it happened, so I assumed whatever had hit us was probably just a large fish that had gotten spooked and bumped the hull before swimming away. When I reeled in my line to check the bait, I found a fish dangling from the hook, but something was horribly wrong with it. The fish was completely mangled. It looked like it had been torn apart by something with incredible force, nearly ripped in half with jagged tears along what remained of its body. The wounds weren't clean cuts like you'd expect from a predator's teeth or claws, but ragged rips that seemed to go in multiple directions, as if the fish had been pulled apart by several different forces simultaneously. My first thought was that a larger fish, maybe a muskie or northern pike, must have attacked it, but I hadn't felt any sort of struggle on the line that would indicate such a violent encounter. The fish had come up easily, almost limply, as if whatever had damaged it had already killed it before I reeled it in. Maybe an otter, I thought, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But again, there had been no struggle, no sudden jerking of the line, no indication that anything had been fighting over my catch. The fish appeared to have been mutilated while it was still on my hook, while I was holding the rod just feet away. A cold knot formed in my stomach as I looked at the mangled carcass. The damage was extensive and violent, far beyond what would be necessary to simply kill and eat the fish. This looked like the work of something that took pleasure in destruction, something that tore things apart, not out of hunger, but out of some other, more disturbing motivation. I tried to dismiss my growing unease and moved to the opposite side of the island, casting from a different angle. But again, within minutes, the fish I'd hooked suddenly stopped fighting mid-struggle. I pulled up another shredded carcass, this one even more severely damaged than the first. Deep gouges ran along its sides, and its head had been nearly severed, hanging by just a thin strip of flesh and bone. This happened 3 more times as I moved around the island's perimeter. Each fish came up mutilated in a different way, some torn lengthwise, others missing chunks of flesh, one with its entire belly opened up and its organs trailing in the water. Whatever was doing this was systematic, violent, and seemingly unstoppable. I found myself staring at the island's dark shoreline, searching for any sign of movement, any indication of what might be lurking beneath the surface of the water. The trees seemed to press closer together here, their branches intertwining to create an almost solid wall of vegetation. No light penetrated to whatever lay beyond that natural barrier. The feeling of being watched intensified with each mutilated fish I pulled from the water. It wasn't the casual observation of wildlife, deer or birds checking out the human intrusion in their territory. This felt focused, intelligent, and malevolent. Something was observing my every move with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled up anchor and moved to a spot much closer to the cabin, where the water was clearer and the morning sun penetrated all the way to the sandy bottom. Within minutes, I was catching normal, healthy fish. Beautiful bass with bright colors and no signs of violence or trauma. But even as I successfully filled my cooler with legitimate catches, I couldn't stop glancing back at that island. Each time I looked, it seemed to be watching me, waiting for something. The dark line of trees along its shore appeared almost like a face in my peripheral vision, though when I looked directly at it, it was just vegetation. When I heard Amanda's car pull into the driveway, I quickly secured the boat and carried my cooler of intact fish up to the cabin. I'd decided not to mention the strange incidents around the island, at least not yet. Amanda was already stressed enough, and I didn't want to ruin our vacation with my paranoid observations about mutilated fish. Over dinner, however, I found myself casually bringing up the subject. "So I noticed there's an island out in the middle of the lake," I said, trying to keep my tone light and conversational. "Have you ever been over there? It looks interesting." Amanda looked up from her plate and something flickered across her face, a brief expression of discomfort that she quickly tried to hide. "Oh, that place? No. Dad always told us to stay away from it. He said the land was still owned by some family and we weren't supposed to trespass." "Really? Someone owns it?" I pressed, suddenly more interested. If the island was private property, that might explain some of the strange feelings I'd been having about it. "Well, it used to be owned by this woman who lived there," Amanda explained, setting down her fork. "According to Dad, she had a house on the island and owned some kind of antique shop in town until maybe 50 or 60 years ago. She died, and I guess the property passed to her family or something." "Wait, someone actually lived on that island? How did she get back and forth?" I asked, genuinely curious now about the logistics of such an isolated existence. "She had to row to the dock every morning just to get to her car," Amanda said. "Can you imagine? Rowing across the lake in the middle of winter in a snowstorm just to go grocery shopping or to work? Dad said she was incredibly tough, but also—" She paused, looking uncomfortable. "Also what?" "Well, he said she was really strange. Antisocial. People in town thought she was weird, and some of the local kids were afraid of her. Dad said that when he was young, they'd sometimes catch her standing on the island's shore, just staring at them while they were fishing or swimming. She'd stand there for hours, never moving, just watching." A chill ran through me as I remembered my own feeling of being observed while fishing near the island. "That's pretty creepy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, but I think Dad was probably exaggerating," Amanda continued. "You know how parents tell stories to keep kids from doing dangerous things. He probably didn't want us rowing out there alone and getting into trouble. So he made up scary stories about the crazy woman who used to live there." "Makes sense," I agreed. But something in Amanda's tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by her own explanation. "There was one story, though, that always bothered me," she continued, lowering her voice slightly. "Dad said that toward the end, before she died, people started noticing that she was acting even stranger than usual. She'd come to town looking terrible, dirty clothes, hair all matted, talking to herself. The shop owners said she'd buy weird things, like she'd come in and buy 10 pounds of raw meat, or dozens of baby dolls, or strange combinations of household chemicals." "What do you think she was doing with all that stuff?" "Nobody knew. And then one day she just stopped coming to town entirely. People figured she'd died, but no one wanted to go out to the island to check. Finally, after a few months, the sheriff took a boat out there to investigate." Amanda paused, looking out the window toward the lake, though the island wasn't visible from our angle. "What did he find?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "The house was still there, but she was gone. Just gone. They never found a body, never found any sign of what happened to her. The house was full of the strangest things, hundreds of dolls arranged in groups, piles of rotting meat, and weird symbols carved into the walls. The sheriff sealed it up and left, and as far as I know, no one's been back there since. I felt my appetite disappearing as Amanda spoke. The mangled fish, the feeling of being watched, the strange darkness that seemed to surround the island. Suddenly it all felt connected to this story of a disturbed woman who had lived there decades ago. "What happened to the house?" I asked. "Dad said it's probably still there, just falling apart. The family that inherited the property lives in another state and has never done anything with it. It's probably just rotting away under all those trees." That night, as we sat reading in the living room, I found myself repeatedly glancing out the window toward the lake. I couldn't see the island in the darkness, but I knew it was there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something on it was looking back at us. Sleep proved impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those mutilated fish, and Amanda's story about the strange woman played on repeat in my mind. By 11 p.m., I'd given up any pretense of trying to rest. Amanda had fallen asleep quickly, she always did after her hospital shifts, and was breathing deeply beside me. I sat up in bed, ostensibly reading, but actually wrestling with a growing compulsion to return to that island. The rational part of my mind knew it was a terrible idea. Going to an abandoned property in the middle of the night, alone, based on local legends and some suspicious fishing incidents, was exactly the kind of behavior that led to missing person reports. But the other part of my mind, the part that had been nagging at me all evening, insisted that I needed to know the truth. If there really was an abandoned house on that island, if Amanda's father's stories had any basis in reality, then I had to see it for myself. The mystery was consuming me, and I knew I wouldn't be able to relax until I had answers. Amanda was completely unconscious, and I knew from experience that she could sleep through almost anything. I'd gotten up for water, used the bathroom, even accidentally knocked over a lamp once, and she'd never stirred. If I was quiet and careful, I could investigate the island and be back before she ever knew I was gone. I gathered my heavy-duty flashlight, my hunting knife just in case I encountered any wildlife, and my phone to document whatever I might find. The night air was significantly colder than it had been during the day, and completely still. No insects, no night birds, not even the sound of fish jumping in the lake. The silence was so complete it felt unnatural, as if all of nature was holding its breath. I made my way down to the dock, wincing at every creak of the wooden planks under my feet. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the absolute quiet of the night. I untied the boat and pushed off, using the oars instead of the motor to avoid making noise that might wake Amanda. Each dip of the oars into the water created small splashes that echoed across the lake like gunshots. The moon was bright enough to navigate by, casting a silver path across the water that led directly toward the island. As I rowed, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and I could see my breath in small puffs of vapor. The island loomed larger and darker as I approached it. In the moonlight, it looked like a solid black mass rising from the water, its trees so dense that no light penetrated into its interior. I circled the perimeter, looking for a suitable place to land, and finally spotted a partially submerged tree stump that would serve as an anchor point. I tied the boat securely and stepped carefully onto the marshy shore. The ground was soft and waterlogged, making sucking sounds with each step. I pushed through the thick undergrowth, branches catching at my clothes and face, until I emerged into what had clearly once been a cleared area. And there, exactly as Amanda had described, stood the remains of a house. The structure was more intact than I had expected, though clearly abandoned for decades. 2 stories of weathered wood siding, most of the windows broken or missing entirely, and a roof that sagged dangerously in several places. Thick vines covered much of the exterior, and trees had grown so close to the building that branches were actually growing through some of the broken windows. I pulled out my phone and started recording, sweeping the camera across the exterior of the house. The moonlight was bright enough to provide decent footage, and I wanted to document everything I found. This was easily the most interesting discovery I'd ever made, and part of me was already imagining the reaction when I showed the footage to friends back home. The front door hung open, twisted on its hinges and surrounded by years of accumulated debris. I shined my flashlight through the opening and saw an interior that was chaos incarnate. Furniture overturned and rotting, debris scattered across every surface, and a smell of decay and mold so strong it made my eyes water. But it was the objects scattered throughout the room that made my blood freeze. Dozens, maybe hundreds of dolls were scattered across the floor, piled in corners, and arranged on the few pieces of furniture that remained upright. Baby dolls, porcelain dolls, cloth dolls, all in various states of decay and dismemberment. Some were missing heads, others had their stuffing pulled out and spread around them like cotton snow. The ones that still had faces stared at me with empty eye sockets or cracked glass eyes that reflected my flashlight beam. I forced myself to step inside, my feet crunching on broken glass and debris. The air was thick and oppressive, and significantly colder than it had been outside. My breath formed visible clouds as I moved deeper into the room, documenting everything with my phone camera. In one corner, I found what appeared to be the remains of a kitchen area. The cabinets were filled with hundreds of glass jars, most of them containing unidentifiable organic matter that had long since rotted beyond recognition. Some still contained what might have been preserved meat, though the contents had turned black and were covered with a fuzzy growth that I didn't want to examine too closely. A staircase led to the second floor, though several of the steps had rotted through completely. I tested the first few steps carefully, and they seemed stable enough to support my weight. The banister was sticky with some kind of residue that I tried not to think about too much. On the second floor, I found 3 bedrooms, each one more disturbing than the last. The first contained a bed that was covered with what had once been children's clothing. Tiny dresses, small pants, miniature shoes, all arranged as if invisible children were wearing them. The second room was filled with more dolls, these arranged in elaborate scenes as if they were acting out some kind of story. But it was the third room that made me seriously consider turning around and leaving immediately. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, tacked up in overlapping layers that covered every inch of available space. Most were old black and white photos of children, some clearly professional portraits, others appearing to be candid shots taken from a distance. Many of the children looked frightened, and some appeared to be crying. But what made the display truly horrifying was that someone had used red ink, or what I hoped was red ink, to draw lines connecting various photographs, creating an elaborate web of connections that covered the entire room. Numbers and letters were written next to many of the photos, and strange symbols were carved directly into the wooden walls. At the center of this mad display was a large mirror, its surface so cracked and dirty that it was impossible to see any reflection. Written across the glass in the same red substance were words that I couldn't quite make out in the dim light of my flashlight. I stepped closer, trying to read the writing, when I heard something that made my heart stop. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from somewhere below me in the house. I stood frozen, my flashlight beam trembling as I strained to listen. The footsteps continued, moving slowly through the first floor of the house. They weren't random. Someone was walking deliberately from room to room, as if searching for something, or someone. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be Amanda? Had she woken up and followed me here? But that made no sense. She had no way of knowing where I'd gone, and she'd never venture out to this island alone in the middle of the night. A local property owner checking on trespassers. That seemed equally unlikely, given the remoteness of the location and the late hour. The footsteps paused directly below me, and I heard what sounded like furniture being moved around. Then they resumed, heading toward the staircase. I realized with growing panic that whoever was down there was coming up to the second floor, where I was trapped with no other way out. I quickly turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall beside the doorway, hoping the darkness would conceal me. The footsteps began climbing the stairs, each creak of the old wood clearly audible in the oppressive silence. As the sounds grew closer, I caught a whiff of something that made my stomach turn. A smell of unwashed human body, rotting meat, and something else that I couldn't identify but that triggered every primitive alarm in my brain. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused. I held my breath, pressing myself deeper into the shadows, praying that whoever was out there wouldn't look in my direction. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure it would give away my location. A voice spoke from the hallway, raspy, uncertain, as if it hadn't been used in a very long time. "I know you're here." It was a woman's voice, but there was something wrong with it. The words were slurred and distorted, and there was an underlying wet sound, as if her mouth was filled with liquid. "I saw you from the water. I've been waiting." The footsteps moved toward the first bedroom, then the second. I could hear her moving things around, searching. The smell grew stronger as she approached my hiding place. "You shouldn't have come here. This is my place. These are my children." I realized with horror that she was referring to the dolls, the hundreds of mutilated, arranged dolls throughout the house. In her disturbed mind, this woman believed they were actual children, and she was protecting them from intruders. The footsteps stopped just outside the room where I was hiding. I could hear her breathing, ragged, labored, with that same wet quality as her voice. Through the doorway, I caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway, and what I saw made me clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from crying out. The figure in the hallway was barely recognizable as human. Dressed in rotting rags, hair matted into thick clumps, skin so pale it was almost translucent. But it was her eyes that were the most terrifying. Wide, unblinking, and completely without any trace of sanity. She wasn't dead, as everyone had assumed. She'd been living on this island for decades, completely isolated, slowly descending into madness. The abandoned house was her fortress, the dolls were her companions, and she'd been existing here like some kind of feral creature for longer than anyone could imagine. "Come out," she whispered, her voice carrying a horrible mix of pleading and threat. "Come meet my babies. They've been so lonely." I knew I had to move. Staying hidden was only delaying the inevitable, and I had no idea what this woman was capable of in her current mental state. I still had my knife, and I was probably stronger and faster than someone who'd been living in isolation for so long. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out from my hiding place and shined my flashlight directly at her. The scream that emerged from her throat was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part human shriek, part animal howl, expressing decades of isolation, madness, and rage. She lunged at me with surprising speed, her fingers extended like claws, aiming for my face. I managed to dodge her initial attack and bolted for the staircase. Behind me, I could hear her crashing through the debris-filled rooms, still screaming that horrible sound. I took the stairs 3 at a time, not caring if the rotted wood gave way beneath my feet. I burst through the front door and ran blindly through the undergrowth toward the boat, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, the screaming continued, joined now by the sound of something large crashing through the forest. I reached the boat and frantically untied it from the stump, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the knots. The screaming grew closer, and I could hear her splashing through the marshy water at the island's edge. Finally, the rope came free, and I pushed off from shore just as she emerged from the trees. In the moonlight, I got a clear look at her for the first time, and the image burned itself into my memory forever. She stood waist-deep in the water, her arms outstretched toward me, still making that inhuman sound. But she didn't follow me into deeper water. Instead, she stood there watching as I rowed frantically back toward the cabin, her screams echoing across the lake until I was far enough away that they faded into the distance. When I reached the dock, I tied up the boat with hands that were still shaking and made my way back to the cabin as quietly as possible. Amanda was still sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of what had happened. I lay awake for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what I'd experienced. By morning, I'd made a decision. We were leaving that day, and I was never telling Amanda or anyone else what I'd discovered on that island. Some secrets are too dangerous to share, and some horrors are better left undisturbed. The woman on the island had found her own way to survive, twisted and terrible as it was, and I intended to let her keep it. But as we packed our bags the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter wasn't over. She knew someone had discovered her secret, and somehow I doubted she would simply let that go. The drive home was silent, filled with my own dark thoughts and the constant urge to check the rearview mirror. Even now, weeks later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear that terrible screaming carried on the wind. I've never told Amanda the truth about that night, and I never will. But sometimes when I catch her looking out at bodies of water with a strange expression, I wonder if some part of her family's stories was true after all, and if the woman on the island isn't the only secret that Lake has been keeping all these years. My name is Oliver Hayes, and I'm 34 years old. This all happened just a few months ago when I decided to drive my RV up the Lost Coast in Northern California. I wanted to escape my life. What little was left of it. My marriage was over, the divorce finalized just weeks before. Irreconcilable differences, the papers had said. I couldn't argue with that. We'd grown apart over the years, two people sharing a space but not a life. The fights had become more frequent, the silences longer. In the end, it was almost a relief to sign the papers and walk away. My photography career was circling the drain too. I'd had some early success, a few gallery shows and magazine spreads, but inspiration had grown elusive, my passion fading with each rejected pitch and dwindling commission. I was going through the motions, taking the same tired shots of the same tired subjects. And then there was my family, or lack thereof. I'd stopped talking to them years ago, after one too many arguments, one too many letdowns. We were strangers bound by blood and little else. I didn't miss the obligatory holiday visits or the strained phone calls on birthdays. So when the idea of a road trip up the Northern California coast took hold, I didn't hesitate. I packed up my RV, threw my camera gear in the back, and hit the road. No plan, no destination. Just me, the open road, and a vague notion of finding something real to hold on to. I got more than I bargained for. It was early November, and the coastal air was damp and heavy as I made my way north on winding roads. The RV wasn't fancy, but it was reliable enough. A little home on wheels, complete with a small kitchenette, a fold-out bed, and a tiny bathroom. I'd spent the last of my savings on it, a final act of rebellion before the realities of single life set in. I had a few days' worth of supplies, some clothes, my camera gear, and an old tattered map I'd picked up at a gas station 100 miles back. It was one of those novelty maps, more artwork than cartography, with hand-drawn illustrations and whimsical notations. That's where I first saw it. Highway 211. The map had a stretch of road marked with thick red ink. Highway 211, it read, closed to all traffic. There was a small illustration next to it, a gnarled tree with a road disappearing into its twisted roots. I couldn't find Highway 211 on Google Maps. There was no mention of it online, no articles or road closure notices. It was as if it didn't exist, wiped from the digital world. But there it was on this old, dog-eared map, a red line snaking up the coast, daring me to follow it. I thought it would make for an interesting story, an abandoned highway swallowed by time and nature. Maybe I could even snap some award-winning photos of the eerie, forgotten stretch. Something to jumpstart my stalled career, to prove I still had the eye, the instinct for a good shot. I should have left it alone. I should have stuck to the main roads, to the safe and well-traveled paths. But I was looking for something real, something raw and unfiltered. And Highway 211, with its red ink and aura of mystery, promised just that. I had no idea what I was driving into. No clue about the horrors waiting for me on that abandoned stretch of road. If I had, I would have turned around and never looked back. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. And my vision was about to get very, very blurry. I was driving through Shelter Cove when I saw her. It was a tiny coastal town, more a collection of weathered buildings than a proper municipality. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were regarded with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. She was standing on the shoulder of the road, thumb out, her dark hair falling in waves over her face. She had a small, beat-up backpack slung over one shoulder and a cardigan wrapped tight around her slender frame. I almost didn't stop. I had a policy against picking up hitchhikers, a policy born of too many late-night horror movies and cautionary tales. But there was something about her. Something that made my foot ease off the gas and my hand reach for the turn signal. Maybe it was the way she stood, her posture weary but determined. Or maybe it was the way she seemed to belong to the misty, gray landscape, as if she'd sprouted from the damp earth itself. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because she looked familiar. Like I'd seen her before, in a dream or a distant memory. I couldn't place it, couldn't pin down the source of the recognition, but it was there, tugging at the edges of my mind. I pulled over, the RV's tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. She smiled as she climbed in, tossing her backpack onto the passenger seat. "Thanks for stopping," she said, her voice soft and slightly hoarse, as if from disuse. "Not a lot of people do these days." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road as I pulled back onto the highway. "Where are you headed?" I asked, more to fill the silence than out of any real curiosity. She hesitated, her gaze drifting out the window to the dense forest blurring past. "Just up the coast," she said finally. "I'm not really sure where." I could relate to that. I wasn't sure where I was going either, beyond a vague notion of north. "I'm Oliver," I said, realizing I hadn't introduced myself. "Janine," she replied, her lips curving into a small smile. We didn't talk much after that. The miles slipped by, the road winding through towering redwoods and along rocky cliffs. Janine seemed content to watch the scenery, her face pressed against the window. She was nice enough, polite and unobtrusive. But there was something off about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Her clothes, for one thing. They looked out of place, like they belonged to another era. Her jeans were high-waisted and acid-washed, her blouse a faded floral print, and her cardigan, a chunky knit in a muted shade of green, looked like it had been plucked from a thrift store rack. But it was more than her clothes. It was the way she held herself, the way she spoke. There was a stillness to her, a sense of being untethered from time and place. And her hands, resting in her lap. They were pale and delicate, the nails short and unpolished. But they were cold to the touch, like she'd been standing in the fog for hours. I shook off the unease, chalking it up to the strangeness of picking up a hitchhiker, to the isolation of the road. We were far from civilization now, the last town a distant memory in the rearview mirror. And then I saw the sign. It was old and faded, the letters barely legible beneath a layer of moss and lichen. Highway 211, it read. Road closed, no entry. Janine sat up straighter, her gaze fixed on the sign. "That's it," she said softly, almost to herself. "That's the road." I glanced at her, surprised. "You've been here before?" She nodded, her eyes still on the sign as it receded behind us. "Once," she murmured. "A long time ago." There was something in her tone, a wistfulness edged with something darker, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But I shook it off, telling myself it was just the eerie, abandoned stretch of road, the thick fog rolling in from the coast. I turned onto the narrow, crumbling road, the RV's tires crunching on the gravel. The trees closed in around us, their branches forming a canopy that blotted out the weak November sun. And as I drove deeper into the forest, deeper into the unknown, I had the uncanny feeling that I was driving into my own uncertain future, into a darkness that would swallow me whole. The fog rolled in without warning, thick and oppressive, like a living thing. It pressed against the windows of the RV, obscuring the road ahead and muffling the sound of the engine. It was like driving into a cloud, a dense, swirling mass that seemed to have a will of its own. I slowed to a crawl, my headlights barely cutting through the murk. The road ahead was a narrow tunnel through the fog, the crumbling asphalt disappearing into the white void. The radio crackled to life, startling me. I wasn't even playing music, had turned it off miles ago. But now static filled the cab, punctuated by brief snatches of garbled voices. "Do you hear that?" I asked Janine, glancing over at her. But she didn't answer, didn't even seem to register my question. Her face was pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass. She was staring into the fog, her eyes wide and unblinking. I reached over to turn off the radio, but the static only grew louder, the voices more insistent. I could almost make out words, fragments of sentences that slipped away before I could grasp them. And then the whispering started. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sibilant hiss that crawled up my spine and burrowed into my brain. It was like the fog itself was speaking, 1,000 voices murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. "Stop," Janine whispered, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear it over the static and the whispering. "Stop the RV." I glanced at her, ready to ask why, but the words died on my lips. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something like recognition, or fear. I eased my foot off the gas, letting the RV roll to a stop. The engine ticked in the sudden silence, the fog pressing in on all sides. And that's when I saw it. The car. It was an old sedan, a rusted hulk half buried in the undergrowth at the side of the road. Its windows were shattered, the metal twisted and dented. It looked like it had been there for years, abandoned and forgotten. But it was the way it was positioned that made my skin crawl. It was nose down in the ditch, its rear wheels sticking up at an odd angle, like it had crashed or been driven off the road. "Looks like it's been here a while," I said, more to break the silence than anything else. But Janine didn't respond. She was staring at the car, her face blank, her eyes unfocused. I reached out to touch her shoulder, to bring her back from wherever she'd gone. But as my fingers brushed her cardigan, she flinched away, her head snapping around to look at me. For a moment, she looked like a stranger. Her eyes were wide and dark, her face a mask of fear and confusion. And then, just as quickly, the moment passed. She blinked, shaking her head as if to clear it. "We shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to go back." But even as she said it, I knew it was too late. The fog had closed in behind us, a solid wall of white that seemed to stretch on forever. And the whispering was getting louder, more insistent. We were trapped, caught in a web of our own making. And as the fog swirled around us, as the whispering filled my ears and my mind, I knew with a sudden, terrible certainty that we might never find our way out again. We drove on, the fog swallowing the road behind us and obscuring the way ahead. The RV's headlights fought a losing battle against the gloom, illuminating only a few feet of cracked asphalt at a time. Janine was silent, her gaze fixed on the mist beyond the windshield. Her hands were clenched in her lap, the knuckles white. I wanted to say something, to offer some word of comfort or reassurance, but my tongue felt heavy and useless in my mouth. About a mile later, just when I thought the road would go on forever, we saw it. The lodge. It loomed out of the fog like a ghost, a hulking shadow that resolved into a weathered 2-story building as we drew closer. Its paint was peeling, the wooden siding warped and rotting. The windows were dark, some of them boarded up, others simply gaping holes filled with shadows. A sign hung crookedly above the porch, the letters faded and chipped. "Hilltop Inn," it read. "Vacancy." I braked, the RV's tires crunching on the gravel of the parking lot. Janine stirred, blinking as if waking from a dream. "I don't remember this being here," she said, her voice soft and uncertain. I frowned, trying to reconcile the decrepit building with the manicured images of roadside lodges in my mind. "It's probably abandoned," I said, turning off the engine. "Closed down years ago." But even as I said it, I felt a tug of curiosity, a pull towards the sagging structure. I grabbed my camera from the passenger seat, my fingers itching to capture the eerie, forgotten place. Janine hesitated as I opened the RV door, the damp, musty air rushing in. "I don't think this is a good idea," she said, but I was already climbing out, my feet crunching on the gravel. The fog swirled around me, cold and clammy against my skin. I lifted my camera, framing the lodge in the viewfinder. The lens focused with a whir, the image sharpening. And that's when I saw them, the faces. They were in the windows, pressed against the glass like pale, contorted masks, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide and staring. I lowered the camera, my heart pounding, but the windows were empty, dark and lifeless. "Oliver?" Janine's voice tight with worry. "What is it?" I shook my head, blinking hard. "Nothing," I said, my voice sounding hollow in my own ears. "Just a trick of the light." But as I raised the camera again, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes boring into my back. I snapped a few quick shots of the lodge's facade, the shutter clicking loudly in the stillness. And then I saw it. A flicker of movement in one of the upper windows, a pale blur that vanished as soon as I focused on it. A chill ran down my spine, a primal sense of wrongness that made my skin crawl. "We should go," Janine said, her hand on my arm. "Please, Oliver." But I was already moving towards the lodge, my feet carrying me up the sagging porch steps. The door was ajar, the wood swollen and warped in its frame. I pushed it open, the hinges shrieking in protest. Inside, the lobby was a ruin of peeling wallpaper and rotting floorboards. A front desk slouched against one wall, its surface thick with dust and debris. Behind it, a staircase rose into darkness, the steps disappearing into shadows. And on the walls, visible in the dim light filtering through the dirty windows, were the faces. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, sketched in faded ink, etched into the crumbling plaster. Contorted in agony, frozen in silent screams. I stumbled back, my camera clutched to my chest. Janine was at the door, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Now." And then I heard it. A sound from above, from the darkness at the top of the stairs. A whisper, a sigh, a breath of air in the stillness. A voice, soft and mocking, drifting down from the shadows. "Welcome," it said, "to the Hilltop Inn." That night, sleep eluded me. We had hurried back to the RV, Janine's hand gripping my arm so tightly it left bruises. I had locked the doors, as if a flimsy metal latch could keep out the horrors that lurked in the fog. But as I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling of the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes boring into me, of whispers just beyond the edge of hearing. And then the tapping started. It was soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the RV's generator, a gentle rapping, like branches brushing against the roof in a breeze. But there was no breeze. The air outside was still and heavy, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, a deliberate rhythm like fingers drumming on a tabletop, or knuckles rapping on a door. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. Janine was awake too, sitting ramrod straight in the passenger seat. Her eyes were wide, her face pale in the moonlight filtering through the fog. "They're coming," she said, her voice flat and toneless. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Who's coming?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stood and moved toward the door, her movements stiff and jerky, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. "Janine," I said, my voice rising in alarm. "What are you doing?" But before I could stop her, before I could even rise from the bed, the pounding began. The entire RV shook with the force of it, the metal walls groaning under the impact. It was as if something massive was slamming against the side of the vehicle, trying to break through. I leapt to my feet, grabbing the keys and stumbling toward the driver's seat. My hands were shaking as I turned the ignition, the engine sputtering to life. Janine was still standing by the door, her hand on the latch. "They won't let us leave," she said, her voice barely audible over the pounding. "We have to try," I shouted, throwing the RV into gear. The tires spun on the gravel as I pressed the accelerator to the floor, the vehicle lurching forward. But as the headlights cut through the fog, I saw them. Figures in the mist, their outlines shifting and flickering like static on a television screen. They had no faces, just smooth, blank expanses of skin where features should have been. And they were moving toward us, their limbs jerking and twitching, their movements unnatural and wrong. "What are they?" I gasped, my voice strangled with terror. Janine turned to me, and for the first time I saw real fear in her eyes. "I didn't survive the crash," she whispered. "None of us did." The words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense. "What are you talking about?" "The car," she said, her voice trembling. "The one we saw on the side of the road, that was us. We crashed years ago. We died on this road." I shook my head, trying to deny it, trying to cling to the fading threads of reality. "That's not possible," I said. "You're here, with me. You're real." She smiled then, a sad, haunted smile. "Am I?" she asked. "Or am I just another ghost, another lost soul trapped on this forsaken stretch of highway?" The pounding intensified, the RV rocking on its suspension. I could hear the metal starting to give way, could feel the cold air rushing in through the growing cracks. "I thought I escaped," Janine said, her voice distant and hollow. "I thought I hitched a ride, found a way out, but there is no escape. They won't let us leave." I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, the engine roaring as the RV surged forward. The figures in the mist scattered, their forms dissolving like smoke on the wind. But more took their place, rising up from the fog, their arms reaching, their mouths gaping in silent screams. They swarmed over the RV, their fingers scrabbling at the windows, their weight dragging us down. And through it all, Janine stood beside me, her form flickering and fading, her edges blurring into the shadows. "They need a replacement," she whispered. "They need someone to take my place." Understanding dawned, cold and terrible. The figures, the lodge, the endless stretch of abandoned highway, it was a trap. A purgatory for lost souls, a limbo between life and death. And Janine was the bait. The lure, drawing unsuspecting travelers into the fog, into the nightmare. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice fading like an echo. "I didn't want this. I didn't choose this. But it's too late now. For both of us." The RV's engine screamed as I pushed it to its limits, the vehicle shuddering and shaking as it tore through the fog. The figures fell away, their grip loosening, their forms dissolving. But in the rearview mirror, I could still see the lodge. The Hilltop Inn, its windows blazing with sickly light, its door gaping like an open mouth. And silhouetted in the doorway, a figure. Tall and slender, with long, dark hair and a face as pale as bone. Janine. Or what was left of her. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. I just drove. The RV careening down the crumbling road, the fog swirling in my wake. And in the passenger seat beside me, a space that had once held a hitchhiker, a lost soul. Nothing but empty air and the lingering scent of decay. Dawn was breaking as I reached the ranger station, the fog finally beginning to lift. The RV was battered and dented, the windows cracked and streaked with grime. But it had held together, carrying me out of the nightmare and back to the waking world. I stumbled into the station on shaking legs, my clothes damp and clinging to my skin. The ranger on duty looked up in surprise, his eyes widening as he took in my haggard appearance. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, rising from his desk. "What happened?" I shook my head, trying to find the words. How could I explain the inexplicable? How could I make him understand the horror I had witnessed, the impossible truth I had uncovered? "Highway 211, I said, my voice hoarse and ragged. I was on Highway 211. The ranger's face paled, his eyes filling with a mixture of pity and understanding. "Ah," he said softly. "You've seen it then." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "You know about it?" He nodded, sinking back into his chair. "I've heard the stories, the legends, that stretch of road. It's cursed." I felt a chill run down my spine, an echo of the terror I had felt in the fog. "Cursed how?" The ranger sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "They say it started with a crash. A car, full of teenagers, driving too fast on a foggy night. They went off the road, into the trees. They were killed instantly." I thought of the rusted sedan, half buried in the undergrowth, the shattered windows, the twisted metal, and Janine's words, whispered in the darkness of the RV. I didn't survive the crash. None of us did. But that was just the beginning, the ranger continued. The stories say their souls became trapped on that road, doomed to wander forever in the fog, and they're not alone. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "What do you mean?" "Over the years there have been other crashes, other accidents, and each time the victims, they don't move on. They become part of the legend, part of the curse." I thought of the figures in the mist, their blank faces, their jerking limbs, the lodge with its contorted sketches and whispering shadows. "And the hitchhikers?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The ranger's eyes met mine, dark with knowledge. "They're the bait," he said. "The lure. They appear to travelers, lost and alone. They draw them in, lead them to the lodge, and then..." He trailed off, his gaze distant. "Those who enter the lodge don't come out. Not really. They become part of it, part of the cycle, trapped, like the others. Forever." I felt sick, my stomach churning with horror and guilt. I had been drawn in, just like the others. Drawn in by Janine, by the promise of a story, of something real. And I had almost become part of the legend myself. "How do you know all this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "How do you know it's true?" The ranger smiled then, a sad, haunted smile that made my blood run cold. "Because I've seen them," he said softly. "The lost souls, the wandering dead. I've seen their faces in the fog, heard their whispers in the night." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. "And because, Mr. Hayes, I was one of them. A long, long time ago." I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. "What?" "I was a young man, full of dreams and ambition. I thought I could outrun my demons, outrun my past. But the road, it has a way of catching up with you." He stood then, moving to the window. The fog was lifting now, the sun beginning to peek through the trees. "I was a hitchhiker once. a lost soul looking for a way out. And I found one. Or thought I did. He turned back to me, his face etched with sorrow. But there is no way out. Not really. The road, it never lets you go. Not completely. I stared at him, understanding dawning like a cold, creeping dread. You're still part of it, aren't you? Part of the curse. He nodded, his eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. I am. And I always will be. But you... He reached out, his hand resting on my shoulder. You have a chance, Oliver. A chance to escape, to leave this place behind. But you have to do it now, before it's too late. I nodded, my throat tight. I understood now, the danger I was in. The danger we were all in, every soul who set foot on that God-forsaken stretch of highway. What about you? I asked, my voice hoarse. Can't you leave too? He shook his head, a rueful smile playing across his lips. It's too late for me, he said. I made my choice a long time ago. But you still have a choice to make. I stood then, my legs shaking beneath me. I knew what I had to do, knew the only path that lay before me. I had to leave. Had to put Highway 211 and its horrors behind me. Had to cling to the fragile thread of sanity that still remained. But as I stepped out into the sunlight, as I climbed back into the battered RV and turned the key in the ignition, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something behind. Something more than just a cursed stretch of road and a handful of lost souls. I was leaving a part of myself, a part that had been touched by the darkness, by the whispers in the fog, a part that would always belong to Highway 211, no matter how far I ran. And as I drove away, as the ranger station receded in the rearview mirror, I couldn't help but wonder, would I ever truly be free? Or would the road and its secrets follow me forever? A haunting reminder of the night I spent in the fog, on a highway to nowhere. The city welcomed me back with open arms, the familiar sights and sounds a balm to my battered soul. But even as I settled back into the rhythms of my life, even as I tried to lose myself in the bustle and noise, I couldn't shake the memories of Highway 211. They haunted me, those memories. The faces in the fog, the whispers in the darkness. Janine's sad, haunted eyes, her final words echoing in my mind. They need a replacement. They need someone to take my place. I threw myself into my work, trying to bury the past beneath a mountain of new projects and commissions. But even as I lost myself in the viewfinder of my camera, even as I captured the beauty and chaos of the city, I could feel the weight of what I had seen pressing down on me. It was the photos that finally broke me. The ones I had taken at the lodge, in those brief, terrifying moments before the truth had been revealed. I had almost forgotten about them, the memory cards tucked away in the bottom of my camera bag. But as I sat at my computer one night, sorting through the images from a recent shoot, I stumbled across them. And there, staring back at me from the screen, was Janine. She looked just as she had in those final moments, her face pale and ghostly in the dim light of the lodge. But it was her eyes that caught me, that held me transfixed. They were wide and staring, filled with a desperate, pleading fear. And in their depths, I could see the reflection of the lodge's windows, the contorted faces pressed against the glass. I scrolled through the other photos, my heart pounding in my chest. And there, in the background of each shot, was a figure. Tall and slender, with long, dark hair and a face as pale as bone. Janine. Or what was left of her. I felt a chill run down my spine, a sickening sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I had brought something back with me, something more than just memories and nightmares. I had brought back proof. Proof of the impossible. of the horrors that lurked on that abandoned stretch of highway. And with that proof came a responsibility, a duty to warn others, to prevent them from falling prey to the same fate that had claimed Janine and so many others. I began to research, to dig deeper into the legends and stories surrounding Highway 211. And the more I learned, the more I came to understand the true nature of the curse that haunted that lonely road. It was a hunger, a desperate need for new souls to feed upon, a cycle of death and entrapment, played out over and over again in the fog and the darkness. And at the center of it all, the lodge, the Hilltop Inn, with its promises of shelter and respite, its lure of warmth and safety in the midst of the storm. But there was no safety there, no warmth, no comfort, only a trap, a prison for the lost and the damned. I knew then what I had to do, knew the only way to break the cycle, to set the souls of Highway 211 free. I had to go back, had to face the horrors of the road once more, had to confront the demons that lurked in the fog. And so, on a cold, gray morning, I found myself back behind the wheel of the RV, the engine rumbling to life beneath me. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of cracked asphalt disappearing into the mist. I felt a shiver run through me, a primal sense of dread that made my skin crawl. But I pushed it down, focused on the task at hand. I had a mission now, a purpose, and I wouldn't rest until it was fulfilled, until the lost souls of Highway 211 were finally set free, even if it meant sacrificing myself in the process. The fog was waiting for me. It rolled in as soon as I crossed the boundary line, a thick, impenetrable wall of white that swallowed the road and the trees whole. But this time, I was ready for it. I had come prepared, armed with knowledge and determination. I knew the secrets of the road now, knew the tricks and traps that lay in wait. And I had a plan. I drove slowly, my headlights barely piercing the gloom. The RV shuddered and groaned beneath me, the engine straining against the weight of the fog. But I pushed on, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I knew what I was looking for, knew the signs and markers that would lead me to my destination. And there, looming out of the mist like a ghostly sentinel, was the lodge. The Hilltop Inn, its windows dark and empty, its door gaping open like a mouth. I parked the RV, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the moment of truth, the point of no return. I stepped out into the fog, the damp, musty air filling my lungs. And there, waiting for me on the sagging porch, was Janine. She looked just as she had in life, her dark hair falling in waves around her shoulders, her eyes wide and haunted. But there was something else there too, a flicker of hope, of desperate longing. "You came back," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the whispering of the fog. I nodded, my throat tight. I had to. I couldn't leave you here, couldn't let this place claim anyone else. She smiled then, a sad, knowing smile. "But you can't save us, Oliver. No one can. We're bound to this place, to the road. Forever." I shook my head, a fierce determination filling me. "No, not forever. I know how to break the cycle, how to set you free." Her eyes widened, a flicker of hope sparking to life within them. "How?" I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around the object I had carried with me. A medallion, ancient and tarnished, its surface etched with strange, twisting symbols. I had found it in my research, a relic of a forgotten age, a talisman of great power. And I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that it was the key to unlocking the curse of Highway 211. "With this," I said, holding it up to the light, "with the power of the ancients, the magic of the old ways." Janine's eyes fixed on the medallion, glowing with a desperate, feverish hope. The ancient metal seemed to pulse in my hand, emanating a power that thrummed through my veins like electricity. How did you find this? She breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. How did you know? I smiled, a grim but triumphant smile. I did my research, I said. After I left this place, after I escaped the fog, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About you. About all the lost souls trapped on this forsaken stretch of road. I paused, gathering my thoughts. This was important. I needed her to understand. Needed her to believe. You see, Janine, this medallion is more than just a piece of old metal. It's a conduit, a channel for an ancient power. A power older than the curse that binds you here, older than the road itself. I held it up, letting the dim light of the lodge glint off its surface. The symbol seemed to dance and writhe, alive with a cryptic meaning. The ancients knew of places like this, thin places where the veil between worlds grows thin and ragged, places where the lost and the damned can become trapped, ensnared by their own grief and regret. Janine was listening intently now, her eyes wide and unblinking. I could feel the weight of her gaze, the desperate, clawing hope that emanated from her in waves. They also knew how to break such curses, I continued. How to shatter the chains that bind the wayward dead to the mortal plane. And that knowledge, that power, it's contained within this medallion. I took a step closer, the fog swirling around us like a living thing. With this, Janine, I can set you free. I can release you, and all the others, from your purgatory. I can let you move on, to whatever awaits you beyond the veil. She was trembling now, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. Please, she whispered. Please, Oliver, I'm so tired. We're all so tired. The road, the lodge, they won't let us rest. They won't let us go. I nodded, understanding. I know, but it ends now. I raised the medallion, holding it aloft like a beacon in the darkness. The symbols flared to life, glowing with an otherworldly light. By the power of the ancients, I intoned, my voice ringing out through the fog. By the will of those who came before, I break this curse. I shatter these chains. I release the lost and the damned from their bondage. The light from the medallion grew brighter, harsher. It pierced the fog like a lance, cutting through the murk and the gloom. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the curse broke. I felt it, deep in my bones. A great unraveling, a cosmic untangling of knots and snarls. The fog began to dissipate, shredding away like cobwebs in a gale. And the lodge began to change. Its walls seemed to ripple and waver, like a mirage in the desert heat. The contorted faces in the windows faded, replaced by a warm, welcoming light. And Janine was changing too. Her form was becoming more solid, more real. The haunted, desperate look was fading from her eyes, replaced by a profound peace and serenity. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you, Oliver, for everything. And then, in a shimmer of light and a whisper of wind, she was gone. They were all gone. The lost souls of Highway 211, released at last from their imprisonment, free to move on, to find their way to whatever lay beyond. And I stood alone in the middle of the road, the medallion cold and inert in my hand. The fog was gone, the sun shining down from a clear blue sky. I had done it. I had broken the curse, had set the ghosts of the highway to rest. But as I stood there, basking in the warmth of the sun and the satisfaction of a job well done, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, that there were other lost souls out there, other cursed places waiting to be found and freed. And I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that this was my calling now, my mission, my purpose. I was Oliver Hayes, Ghostbreaker, Curse Lifter, and I had work to do. It was Devil's Night in 2011. I was hanging out with my boyfriend at the time and his friend. I'll call them A and B. We were driving around trying to figure out what to do for the night. And with it being a creepy night, ghost hunting was definitely top priority. But we weren't sure where we'd end up. B said, "Why don't we go to the old tuberculosis hospital in the next town?" I had never been there, but old abandoned hospitals where all this hurting and death occurred really had my interest. So, we drove the short distance to the hospital. Truth be told, this was not totally legal. So we parked down the street at the local bar and made our way to the hospital on foot. Upon walking onto the property, I instantly got an uneasy feeling. But I saw it, this monstrous Gothic-style hospital. We made our way to the back of the building, looking for a way in. B found a loose panel of wood covering a window on the ground floor. A went in first, then I entered. Remember how I said I had an uneasy feeling? Well, it was about to start turning into signs that we should not be there. As B was climbing through the window, he somehow twisted his knee and could barely walk after getting into the building. As A was talking to B, trying to figure out if we should even continue, even though we just got there, I started to look around the room we were in. It looked like some kind of waiting room area, but much bigger. There were chairs stacked up along the walls and a random wheelchair sitting in the middle of the room. B agreed that he was okay to go on. He didn't want to ruin the night. We slowly made our way deeper into the hospital. Oled and I followed behind him, trying to stay close since we only had 2 flashlights, and B was following behind us going at his own pace. We came across a long hallway with doors all open. There were piles of burned patient files, looking like they were trying to hide things that went on in there. As we walked along, the guys told me that this place, after being a TB hospital, was turned into a state mental hospital. We all know how people were treated back then, not very well. I walked into a room that still had patient files that weren't burned yet. I rummaged through some of the files. Some of the worst cases were there by some of the files I'd read. So we continued down this long, creepy corridor. I was shining my flashlight into the rooms as we walked down the hallway. Everything was there. Everything. Like someone came in, told everyone to get out, and they all left and tried to burn the evidence. Not doing a very good job of it. I saw a room with tubs, I'm guessing ice bath therapy, and also a machine that looked like an electroshock therapy device. At the end of the long T-shaped hallway, you could go left to the cafeteria, or right to the elevators and stairs. Me being a stupid teenager seeing a chalkboard, I wrote my name on it. And after doing so, I turned around to look to see where the guys were. I started to walk closer to the elevators, which had doors open, and the elevators at the bottom of the shaft. As I walked past the open elevator doors, I noticed that the exit sign and the emergency lights had turned on. Now that should not be possible. There was absolutely no power left to the building. None. As I turned around to ask the guys if those lights should be on, all of a sudden the entire side of the building lit up. We hurried to hide, knowing darn well it was probably the cops. Now our hiding was fast, so not too much time to find a room or whatever. I hid to my left by a bunch of tables. B to the right of me, and me right in front of the open elevator doors. Slowly, the lights from outside began to move around the building. We sat there for a good 20 to 30 minutes, while the lights continually circled the building. As we were hiding, we began to hear noises coming from down the hall, and above us, and just everywhere around. We knew the cops had entered the building, and they were searching for us. Crashing noises like they were overturning the tables and opening doors. After what felt like an eternity, listening to all these noises around us, the lights came around one more time. Where I was sitting, I could see down the hallway, and when the lights made that last turn, I looked to a door that I saw movement at. To my horror, as the light started to light up that room from the outside, I saw a man dressed as a doctor exit the door I was looking at. He walked out of the room and turned towards me. He made eye contact, and he threw his arms up, turned, and walked down the hallway. I asked the guys if they had seen what I had, and they said no. At that point, I was ready to get the heck out of there. So, me being completely freaked out, the guys agreed that the cops had no idea where we were hiding. We would just make it easier on them. We would come out and turn ourselves in, since it didn't seem like they were going to leave. So we made our way out of the hospital, back down that long, scary hallway where I just saw a doctor walk out of a room. As we made our way back to the window that we had entered through, the cop grabbed us one by one and dragged us out through the window and threw us against the building. When we were all lined up along the wall, the cop demanded to know if there was anyone else with us. I said, "No, it's just us." "Why? Did you find anyone else?" "We heard you moving things around looking for us." He looked me in the eyes and said, "No, we never entered the building. We just drove around the building, shining our spotlight through the windows. And the only reason we didn't leave was because every turn we made, we saw someone walking around it." At that moment, I realized all those noises we'd heard were probably the ghosts of the residents and the patients that once occupied the building. Now, it being not so legal, we did get booked for breaking and entering, which I had to do community service for. Now, years later, being an avid, creepy paranormal lover, I was watching paranormal caught on camera, and this building made the show. A man was ghost hunting and was in the basement. He caught an apparition that moved and looked exactly like the doctor that I saw that night. Still to this day, that hospital scares me, but it also still draws me in. I drive past it every once in a while when I'm in that area. I would love to know who or what I saw and heard that night.